Media at McGill is a hub of research, scholarship, and public outreach on issues and controversies in media, technology, and culture. Visit us online at media.mcgill.ca.
We know what our traditions are. And the anger against them was so great that one Israeli journalist on the newspaper Marif, his name was Yehuda Nuriel, which means he was a Baghdadi Jew. It's a Baghdadi Jewish name, who had gone to Israel whenever his family had. And he had a column. He used to have a full page in Marif, which is not the most radical paper in Israel, called Nuriel's World. And he did something which even I found a bit provocative and which no one in the West could even dream of doing. He got so angered by the constant attack on these pilots and their families and their children being spat on at schools, that he went into the library, researched something, and in next week's paper published in his column, Nuriel's World, a whole page denouncing the Israeli pilots in savage terms, and said that this was an article that had been submitted to him by someone he didn't know, whose name was A. Schicklgruber. Now, some of you know that that was Hitler's real name, and what he had gone and done inside the library is dug out Mein Kampf and all Hitler's speeches denouncing dissent, cobbled them together, which was quite an achievement to make them coherent, and said, this is an article denouncing the Israeli pilots. Every single word used was from Hitler's speeches. Well, for 2 or 3 days, no one knew. And this article was reprinted in other papers and other magazines till someone in Jerusalem said, "What the hell is going on?" and rang up the editor. And they fired this guy. And he gave a press conference and he said, I knew they would fire me, but it was worth doing. Now, that sort of journalist has virtually disappeared from the Western world. Someone who just puts his or her job on the line to make a point and challenges orthodoxy. And that's why my criticism of the Western media is not that they're craven on this question because they're scared, but that they don't even have the guts to publicly praise the courageous Israeli journalists who are reporting what they are reporting. And let's move now from the Middle East to the third war that is being fought, which concerns this country, which is the war in Afghanistan, and how this war is being reported. This is not an unimportant war. This was meant to be the good war. Iraq was the bad war. Afghanistan was going to be the good war. Why was it going to be the good war? Because as Mrs. Blair and Mrs. Bush explained to an incredulous nation, they said the war in Afghanistan is a war to liberate Afghani women from the Taliban. And when I was asked to comment on it, I said, well, this would be interesting because it would certainly make history. It would be the first war waged to liberate women. And I hope they succeed, I said slightly sarcastically, but I somehow doubt it. Bush was, of course, more open about it and said that this is a war which has one aim, to capture Osama bin Laden dead or alive, which was closer to the mark. But they failed to do that either. So Osama wasn't captured, and nor was Mullah Omar, and the NATO occupation is now in its, 6th year. And it is getting more and more tricky for them. And why? Because this war is waged at a very strange time in world politics, where only one economic orthodoxy, neoliberal economics, is dominant. And so the way in which they reshape Afghan society doesn't do anything for ordinary people. That's the big problem. Because lots of Afghans, to be totally frank with you, were quite relieved when the Taliban was removed. It wasn't a popular government. They were quite relieved. But when they saw that a bunch of people implanted there from the United States Hamid Karzai, who would have been better off showing off shawls on a Parisian catwalk because he loves shawls. And his brother, who was running an Afghan restaurant in Baltimore. I remember I once went and they said, this is Karzai's brother's restaurant. So I said, maybe we shouldn't be here. He went back and was implanted into Afghanistan and is today regarded as one of the top gun runners, arms smugglers, and heroin merchants in the country. All the prime land in Kabul was seized by Karzai and his cronies, often cabinet ministers, guarded by NATO troops, constructing villas, lavish villas in the heart of Kabul, when all it costs to build an apartment or a little house, single-story house, which could put 4 or 5 Afghans, even more probably, is $5,000. That's all it costs to build a very elementary house to house the Afghan refugees. But all the money was siphoned off by corrupt politicians in charge. That began to anger people, and you had anti-American riots in Kabul 2 years ago precisely because of this issue. Barely reported. Barely reported. Then you had the Taliban reformed and started attacking the NATO armies. Now, initially, they didn't have much support, but the response of the United States was to use bombers to go and bomb people. And often, they did it in a sort of shooting from the hip way. They didn't care who they killed. And if you study the reports which have appeared on pages 6, 7, and 8 of most newspapers, 70 Taliban killed, 80 Taliban killed, 90 Taliban killed, 20 Taliban killed, and you add it up, you suddenly find that if this is actually the case, then the Taliban must have a phenomenally large army inside Afghanistan. And it's these killings now which have turned many, many Afghans totally against the NATO occupation, and they are not going to be able to pull it off. Just not going to be able to pull it off because they've done absolutely nothing in terms that would make real sense in terms of health, education, housing for ordinary Afghans who have known nothing but war now for the last 35 years. So this isn't going to help the situation. When people say to me, well, what would help? I said, the only way now. And this government which we were told, the Taliban, which was a pretty awful government, I grant you, but it was demonized beyond reality. This is the most evil government that has ever existed on the face of the earth, which, come on, give us a break. You don't have to exaggerate. But now, the United States has authorized Karzai to open negotiations with the Taliban to see if he can bring them into his government. So what price all the propaganda against the Taliban in the Western media? Why the Taliban are saying we won't talk to you till there are no foreign soldiers left in the country. And this is a part of the world where the culture of revenge is very strong still. It's essentially a tribal society, pretty largely. And the one thing they're all agreed on is they don't like being occupied by foreigners. Now, this is something people in the United States find it difficult to understand sometimes. But it's to most people in the world, it's pretty normal, especially a country which was never occupied. The British tried it in the 19th century. They waged 2 wars and they were defeated. The Russians tried it in the 20th century. They were defeated. Now the NATO armies are trying it out with the United States at the head, and they are finding out it's not going to work. And the only solution here, if one is being serious, is to have all the regional powers who have influence, Iran in Western Afghanistan, the Russians in Northern Afghanistan, Pakistan in Southern Afghanistan, and India is the largest regional power in the country, in that whole area, to sit down and agree on a national government, peaceful government, and for all these regional powers to guarantee peace and security there.